Hello and welcome to the channel. In this video we'll see 10 different ways to run a VBA macro in Excel. This could be a recurring macro or a macro you've created or copied into a standard module. As an example, we're going to use this macro here in module 1. It is important to note that the macro is a public procedure because most of the methods we're going to see only work with a public macro. So sub is the same as public sub as opposed to private sub. And SAP is the type of procedure, a SAP procedure, which is the most common type of procedure. You want to know more about that? Go and check the tutorial for beginners in this channel. A public procedure or macro can be run from any other place in the document or even from other workbook. The procedure is called macro example, and it just displays a message box saying macro example. So the first way to run a macro is going to view macros, select the macro and run. There you go. We can also view macros under the developer tab here. And if you don't have the developer tab and you want to add it, again, check the tutorial for beginners in this channel. Number 2, we can add a keyboard shortcut to run the macro. We do that going to view macros again, and then options down here, and choose the shortcut key that is used along with control. I often add the letter M to run macros while testing, so M and then OK. If I click on the keyboard now, Control M, it runs the macro. Number 3, we can use the play button up here in the VBA editor if you have a standard toolbar. It says Run Sub User Form, or here in the Run folder next to the Debug folder, as this is part of the Debug tools too, or just pressing F5 while on the VBA editor and with the cursor in the macro we want to run. So the cursor is in here, then click Run, and there we go. Number 4, we can run a macro from a button or any other shape. Let's go here and add a button, then right-click and assign the macro. We can change the caption to, for example, click me, and when click the button, it runs the macro. We could add any other form control, for example, a checkbox, and assign the macro, and then whenever we tick or untick the box, it runs the macro. In this case, we may want to put some conditional statement to check if the box is checked to do something, and if it's unchecked, do something else. We can assign a macro to any other type of shape in the same way, a picture, an outer shape. Let's add a rectangle, and again, right-click, assign macro. We can change the text to, and when clicked, it runs the macro. Number 5. We can run a macro from an icon in the quick access toolbar up here where we have the save button and do and redo buttons. So if we right click and customize the quick access bar and we choose here macros where it says choose commands from, then we can select and add the macro to the toolbar along with the other buttons. Click OK. Now it shows an icon associated with the macro, and if we click, it runs the macro. Number 6, we can also run a macro from an icon added to the ribbon. We right click the ribbon and choose to customize the ribbon, and we get a dialog quite similar to the one we've seen before. And again, we choose macros in the drop down on the left, but now we need to create a custom group to add the macro. It won't let you add it to a regular tab. So I'll go down here and add a new tab, and I'm going to call it macros, and then also a new group, which is there by default, and I'll rename it to simple macros, and now we can add the macro. We can also change the name or the symbol for the macro. I'm going to leave the default. And now we get a new tab up here on the right, and just the group simple macros with the macro. And if we click it, yes, it runs the macro. Number 7, we can run a macro as a result of a worksheet event. That means the macro can run when selecting a worksheet, when changing the selected cell or range, or when changing the value in a cell or range, etc. We need to go to the worksheet module, select worksheet up here, and then choose the event on the right. By default, we get the selection change event procedure. So if we call the macro from within this procedure, it will run when the selection changes. We can just write macro example or use call macro example. So now, whenever we select another cell or range, it runs the macro. We can do the same when the value changes. For that, we need to add the change event here and put the macro there. And now, if I change a value, it will run. Only when changing the value. Also adding or deleting a value, but not changing the format or anything like that. We can also target a particular cell or range. So for example, if we want to run the macro only when cell B2 changes, this cell here, then we need to use the target parameter here, which is a target cell or range that has changed. So if the target address is the absolute reference to cell B2, then we call the macro. So if I change the value of any other cell, nothing happens. But if I change the value of B2, it runs a macro. We can also run a macro when selecting other sheets. Let's add another 1 or 2 sheets, and if I go to sheet 3, for example, select worksheet and the activate event to call the macro, call macro example, then when moving to sheet 2, nothing happens, but when moving to sheet 3, it runs a macro. We can do the same with any other event, and we could also do something like that with chart sheets. Number 8, we can run a macro as a result of a workbook event. It could run when the workbook opens, or before saving or closing. It's quite similar to what we've seen before. We need to go to this workbook and select workbook here, and then choose an event. We get the open event by default. If we call the macro from within this procedure, it will run when the workbook opens. We can also run the macro when selecting any sheet. Before, we did it for a particular worksheet, but now, if we use the sheet activate event and call the macro here, it will run when activating any sheet in the workbook. And we could use any other event in this list. Number 9, we can run a macro from a hyperlink. This could be useful to run a piece of code doing something, background check or something else when following a hyperlink. So let's add a hyperlink here, hyperlink to run the macro, for example, and just link it to the same sheet and cell. But this could be a hyperlink to any other location, a workbook or a website, etc. And then we need to add an event procedure to the worksheet, as we've done before, to follow hyperlink. And here we call the macro. So if I click the hyperlink, it runs a macro. And finally, number 10, we can call a macro from another macro or procedure. We've actually kind of done that already with event procedures, but now we'll do it from a procedure in a standard module. So here in module 1 or in module 2, we have another macro, the caller macro, where we're going to call the macro example. So now, if I run this macro with any of the different ways we've seen in this video, I'm just going to use the play button up here to run it. It runs and calls the other macro that displays the message box. So those were 10 different ways to run a VBA macro in Excel. Thanks for watching.